For 100,000 years, the human mind was a locked room. Imagine possessing the exact same biological architecture you have at this very moment. The same cranial capacity, the same vocal cords, the same intricate web of neurons, yet living in a state of absolute unbreakable silence. You walk across the scorched earth of the Pleistocene, your hands capable of engineering marvels, but your mind unable to grasp anything beyond the sharp edge of a chipped flintstone. This is not a fringe theory, but rather the verifiable, agonizing reality of our ancestors, a massive temporal gap that anthropologists call the sapient paradox. We were anatomically modern walking ghosts, haunting the savannas, waiting in the dark for a spark that seemed like it would never come. And then, roughly 50,000 years ago, an invisible, violent shockwave tore through the human consciousness. The locked room was suddenly blown wide open, and the archaeological record explodes with the sudden birth of symbolic culture. The modern world is deeply addicted to easy answers. We consume highly edited media that tells us this sudden, inexplicable cognitive explosion was the result of an alien software update, a deliberate intervention by extraterrestrial scientists who descended from the heavens to genetically modify our ancestors. It is an incredibly seductive narrative popularized in the late 1960s by figures like Erich von Däniken and later Zecharia Sitchin, and it is aggressively maintained by those who prefer the comfort of science fiction over the terrifying complexity of actual history. But evolutionary biology, genetics, and physical anthropology categorically reject this intervention of off-world deities. The genuine mysteries of human antiquity do not require flying saucers or reptilian overlords to be profoundly terrifying and deeply awe-inspiring. The truth is not found by looking up at the stars, but by looking deep into the microscopic spiraling architecture of our own cells, and into the brutal, unforgiving dust of the earth from which we narrowly escaped. The transition to behavioral modernity is the culmination of gradual neurological adaptations, a mystery rooted in the mud and the blood of a dying world. To truly understand the sudden emergence of this complex human behavior, the sudden appearance of intricate tools, breathtaking representational art painted by the flickering light of animal fat lamps deep within subterranean caves, and the very concept of burying our dead with complex rituals, we must first understand the crucible of our near extinction. Before the Great Awakening, the fossil and genetic records paint a grim, suffocating picture of the human condition. We were pushed to the absolute brink of erasure. Severe, catastrophic climate change and merciless droughts across the African continent squeezed early Homo sapiens into tiny, isolated pockets of survival. The populations collapsed and our genetic diversity withered. This was the great bottleneck of the late Pleistocene, a period where humanity was just a dying ember waiting to be snuffed out by the cold. You and I and every single human being alive today exist only because a microscopic fraction of our lineage somehow endured this agonizing gauntlet. This desperate band of survivors eventually exploded out of Africa around 50 to 60,000 years ago to completely replace the Neanderthals and Denisovans, though how our specific ancestors survived this biological apocalypse while so many other hominids perished remains a subject of intense, unresolved academic debate. It was from this desolate, near-empty world that a solitary biological thread was cast forward through the millennia. In 1987, a scientific revelation occurred that forever altered our understanding of human history, a discovery so profound it accidentally bridged the gap between modern genetics and ancient theology. In a landmark paper published in the journal Nature, a team of pioneering geneticists, including Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson, meticulously analyzed a very specific type of genetic material known as mitochondrial DNA. Unlike the DNA in your nucleus, which is a chaotic, shuffling mixture of all your ancestors, mitochondrial DNA is inherited strictly cleanly and unbroken through the maternal line. By extracting this material from the placentas of women across diverse ancestral backgrounds, these researchers painstakingly mapped the variants winding the genetic clock backward. They built a massive phylogenetic tree that steadily converged, branch by branch, until it rested upon a single maternal ancestor localized in the heart of Africa. The media frenzy was instantaneous and deafening. Magazine covers, most notably a famous issue of Newsweek, blared the arrival of Mitochondrial Eve, a brilliant but deeply misleading moniker that instantly intertwined rigorous genetic sequencing with the Judeo-Christian theology of the Book of Genesis. The public imagination was captivated by the idea of a literal singular mother of all the living standing alone in a primordial Eden. But mainstream geneticists vehemently and aggressively clarify that this is a vast misconception. Mitochondrial Eve was neither the first woman to walk the earth, nor was she the only woman alive during her time. She was simply one member of a larger population of early modern humans estimated to have lived somewhere between 140,000 and 200,000 years ago. The harsh reality of statistical probability dictates that the mitochondrial lineages of her female contemporaries eventually went extinct, snapping like fragile threads over the millennia, whenever a lineage produced only male offspring, which irrevocably halts the transmission of mitochondrial DNA. Her unbroken chain of daughters just happened to survive the gauntlet of time. Furthermore, advanced full genome sequencing conducted by researchers at the University of Cambridge now indicates our descent is even more complex, pointing to at least two distinct ancestral populations that diverged roughly 1.5 million years ago before reconnecting in a highly complex web of genetic introgression. Yet even as science corrects the theological oversimplifications, the raw underlying biological mechanics of our awakening remain staggering. When you ask who invented language, or where the sudden capacity for complex abstract thought originated, you must look at the literal architecture of our chromosomes. Humans possess 46 chromosomes, while all other great apes, including chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans, possess 48. This is not a subtle difference. Modern genetics has revealed a spectacular mechanical anomaly within our DNA. Human chromosome 2 is the precise head-to-head fusion of two ancestral primate chromosomes. Evolutionary biologists view this fusion as a natural mutation occurring after our lineage split, but it highlights a stark, incredibly specific divergence in our biological makeup. But the fusion of chromosomes alone does not build a civilization, nor does it write poetry or coordinate the logistics of a megalithic construction site. For that, humanity required a voice. The capacity for complex articulate speech is inextricably tied to a very specific gene known as FOXP2. While this gene exists in many mammals and birds, the human variant contains a unique, highly targeted mutation, a threonine to asparagine substitution that occurred roughly 300,000 to 400,000 years ago. This single alteration profoundly changed the corticobasal ganglia circuits within the human brain, granting our ancestors the unprecedented delicate motor coordination of the larynx and the mouth required to produce complex speech. We emerged from the red dust anatomically complete, biologically preloaded with the hardware, yet sitting in the dark, waiting for the evolutionary trigger to finally activate the software of human capability. The sapient paradox demands an answer, because as the ice sheets began to retreat and humanity spread across the globe, they did not just learn to speak, they learned to build. Long before they understood how to plant a single field of wheat or domesticate a single beast of burden, an inexplicable burning desire drove thousands of nomadic hunter-gatherers to a limestone plateau in ancient Turkey. The true builders of civilization were waking up, and the impossible monuments they left behind would soon whisper of ancient sages, divine watchers, and a cataclysm that nearly swallowed the earth whole. But that is a darker descent into the stones and the bones, where the true history of our architects awaits. Imagine standing on a sun-baked limestone plateau 12,000 years ago, the dry Anatolian wind whipping coarse, biting dust into your eyes. You have no metal tools, no beasts of burden, and your language does not even possess a word for the wheel. Yet before you lies a logistical nightmare that defies the modern understanding of human history. Thousands of nomadic hunters, men and women, whose entire existence has been a desperate daily scramble for survival, are moving a 20-ton pillar of solid rock. You can hear the deafening rhythmic chanting of the laborers, the sickening crack of muscle and bone giving way under impossible strain, and the sharp metallic clinking of flint chisels biting into unforgiving stone. This is Göbekli Tepe. Before humanity knew how to plant a single seed of wheat, before they had engineered the simplest irrigation ditch, they were consumed by a singular burning obsession to build a monumental sanctuary. The mainstream archaeological paradigm once dictated that agriculture was the absolute prerequisite for civilization, that only a settled, well-fed society had the luxury of inventing organized religion and monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe shatters that timeline entirely, proving the exact inverse. The primal, terrifying urge to reach out to the divine, to carve colossal T-shaped pillars and align them with the cosmos came first. The sheer desperation to feed the massive, starving workforce required to build these megaliths is what likely forced our ancestors to invent agriculture. But what could possess a scattered, traumatized species to suddenly coordinate such a massive undertaking? What phantom were they trying to appease, or what apocalypse were they trying to remember? Proponents of the Younger Dryas. Impact hypothesis suggests that roughly 12,800 years ago, fragments of a disintegrating comet slammed into the Earth, melting the ice sheets, triggering mass extinctions, and drowning the world in a sudden violent cataclysm. Whether you believe in a literal comet or simply the brutal, unforgiving shifts of the Pleistocene climate, the stones of Göbekli Tepe are the physical manifestation of a traumatized species trying to anchor themselves to the earth so they would never be washed away again. This deep-seated generational trauma, this inherited terror of a world-ending flood, eventually calcified into the ultimate human hubris. Fast forward thousands of years to the sun-drenched plains of southern Mesopotamia, where civilization seemingly exploded out of the Stone Age in an impossibly short span of time. Around 4000 BC, the Sumerians suddenly possessed cuneiform writing, complex legal codes, and the sexagesimal mathematical system, the base 60 geometry we still use today to measure the hands of a clock and the degrees of a circle. Ancient myths claim this knowledge was not earned, but handed down by the Apkallu, 7 mysterious antediluvian sages who emerged from the primeval waters carrying symbols of purification identical to the bizarre handbag motifs carved into the ancient pillars of Göbekli Tepe millennia earlier. But when esoteric knowledge is handed to a species ruled by fear, the result is never enlightenment. It is tyranny. We spend our entire lives looking up at the sky, desperately searching for salvation or destruction in the stars. We obsess over the idea that ancient aliens or luminous beings from the heavens are the true architects of our destiny, that they hold the secret codes to our sudden awakening and our complex DNA. But what if the greatest deception in human history is the belief that the answers are out there? We worship the towering monuments, the artificial lights, and the mechanical rockets, but the sword that saves the world always comes from the dark, quiet guts of the earth. The ancient texts tell us we were formed from the red clay, and perhaps our ancestors didn't need spaceships to perceive the architecture of life. Perhaps they just closed their eyes, entered the deep, terrifying trance of the cosmic serpent, and looked inward, finding the divine spark hidden within the double helix of their own cells. You cannot outbuild the universe, and you cannot outrun the quiet terror of your own mortality. So I leave you with this choice. Do you choose the safe, loud lie of the tower, desperately stacking bricks until you inevitably fall? Or do you choose the dangerous, quiet truth of the fire stripping away everything you own until you find the only thing that cannot be burned? The era of building is over. The era of the inward collapse has already begun. If you want to witness what happens when the final brick falls, and if you want to understand the ancient mechanisms hiding inside your own blood, you know exactly what to do. Subscribe to survive the next chapter.